Good afternoon. I'm Andy Skidmore from Lallemand Animal Nutrition, and my role there is as providing technical support to the sales and commercial part of the business in North America. So when I talk about silage, one of the things I always like to start out with is to remind everybody to be safe. Safety is a large issue when we deal with the ensiling of forages and of feedstuffs, and it is something very important, and our objective is that everybody return home every day to their families, and that's something that's very important to us as well as to myself. So as a reminder, be safe. It's very easy to get too comfortable when working around silage because we do it every day, but things can happen. Be aware of the hazards and be safe all the time. So I wanted to start out when we talk about feed preservation, and I specifically say preservation because when we harvest the feed, we need to preserve as much of the nutrients as possible for the cow for productive purposes. And so that is the entire process is a preservation process, and it's important to make that distinction that we are preserving, and in no way in the ensiling process do we improve quality or dry matter retention of nutrients, but it's all about preserving as much as possible of what we have grown in order to feed it to the cows for productive purposes. When we preserve feed, there's only two methods of doing that. One is to take out all of the water, and so when we dry grain or hay down, we dry it to a level to where the feed is preserved. The other way is to take all the air out and then let the ensiling process or fermentation then control the preservation of the nutrients in the feed. Those are the only two ways in which we can preserve the nutrients in a feed for productive purposes. When we talk about silage can often become contaminated, and primarily through three different categories of contamination. One would be microorganisms, things like salmonella, coliforms, listeria, and other bacteria that can get into, or protozoa, whatever, that can contaminate the silage and create problems. Another one would be undesirable chemicals, and those can come in the way of mycotoxins as a result of molds that may be growing within the plant or the feedstuff. And the other category would be undesirable chemicals, which are usually the result of some fermentation byproduct that is not desirable into the crop or nutrient. One of the other key points is the effect of feeding spoiled feed on the performance of the animal. So there was a very nice study done that I really like that was done at Kansas State by Lance Whitlock. And in this study, they on purpose put feed up into a silo. They took every other load, put one load into an ag bag and called that normal silage, and the other one they put into a bunker silo and called that spoiled. They left it open. After packing it and putting it in there, they left it open for 90 days, then covered it to try and stabilize the silage there. And then they fed that to 12 steers that were rumen cannulated so that they could monitor the steers, and fed it at varying levels. The result of that particular study, the biggest result was that the decrease in nutrient digestibility of that feed, that it had a tremendous effect on the digestibility because of the changes that occurred during the spoiling process. But the other part was that you had from 36 inches depth of that silage was reduced to 15 inches. So there's at least a 21-inch loss there, which is a tremendous amount of feed. One of the other significant points made, or two of them, one would be that the first increment of spoiled feed that was included in the ration had the largest effect. So including just a small amount in the diet had a huge effect. Adding more did not have as large or a magnitude effect on the feed, even though it did have an increasing effect on digestibility of the feed. The other significant finding was that the rumen mat within the rumen on these steers was completely destroyed. So whatever the spoiled feed did, it destroyed the integrity within the rumen, which is going to affect performance on the animals as well. So the other significant point on preserving feed is the aerobic stability. Before we were talking about front end, which is preserving the feed on the front end during the fermentation process to preserve it. The other end is the back end, and that's the feed out process, which is also very important. So if we do a good job up front, we also need to do a good job at the back end and feed out. And aerobic stability becomes a very important issue there. Aerobic stability is defined as how long, how many hours it takes for feed after it's been exposed to oxygen to reduce or to increase in temperature by 2 degrees centigrade. And so that's measured in hours. And that is the definition of aerobic stability. So how we manage that feed out then becomes very important. But we also need to understand the spoilage process, in that it is yeast that start the spoiling process. So you get wild yeast that are incorporated into the silage because they're normally out there in the field. And the yeast love to eat lactic acid. And so lactic acid being the primary acid produced in the fermentation process. So there's lots of food for it to eat. There's lots of oxygen as soon as you open the silage. The only other thing it needs is a little bit of heat, a little temperature. So as soon as the temperature gets above 50 degrees, the yeast wake up and they go crazy. So they eat all the acid. The pH goes up, and they start eating some of the food there that's available for molds and yeast to grow on. And so the pH goes up because the lactic acid is gone, and that creates conditions that are good for mold to come in, and that's when we start seeing the differences, is the mold. And so the yeast also create a lot of heat, and that's what's creating the heating process that allows the molds to come in and take over, and that's when we actually visibly see the changes that are going on. So in order to prevent that, we need to manage our piles such that they need to be very important or very stable. What's important is that we do a good job putting the forages in, so that there's no spoilage on there, so we can feed out the entire amount that we've harvested and as much of it as possible, and so we're not affecting the performance of the cows, and also that always be safe. So whatever you put in is what you get out. The ensiling process only preserves what's there or destroys, depending on how well we do.